Welcome to the Sort It Out SI League Guide for Europe. Wait, are we sure that's right? Okay, welcome to the League Guide for Europe, where we'll go through the competition format for the three main UEFA club competitions and importantly cover the changes for these formats for the second season on Football Manager 2024. As you'll know, if you've gone beyond the end of the first season on FM24, the formats for the UEFA Champions League, Europa League and Europa Conference League are changing. In this video, we'll go through how the qualification rounds work for these competitions, the existing formats, and the new formats of the competition proper as well. So we'll start by taking a look at a very handy page on the game. If you're not sure where it is, you need to go to Europe, and then you can find the qualification places and the coefficient table by nation, which basically assigns which places are handed out. Every team participating in one of the three continental club competitions earns a coefficient based on their results, with the general rule being 2 points for a win and 1 for a draw. These points are halved during qualification rounds, and there are bonus points on offer for qualifying for certain rounds of the competition proper as well. The coefficient for each nation is then the average of all teams from that nation in any given season, and the qualification places and association rankings are awarded on a rolling 5-year sum of these coefficients. You can check it out in the table. It's kind of self-explanatory once you are getting your head around what each of the numbers means. The qualification places awarded are based on the positions in the coefficient rankings from the 2 seasons before. So the places awarded for the 23-24 season, so the first season on FM24, are based on the ranking at the end of the 21-22 European season. So the end of the 22-23 season will set 24-25, and so on and so forth. So for the 2023-24 season, the Champions League has a total of 78 teams entering, with 32 making the competition proper. A further 21 teams enter the Europa League directly, with 36 teams being filtered down from various stages of the Champions League to join the competition, and then finally an additional 135 teams enter the whopping Europa Conference League, with 43 filtering in from either the Champions League or the Europa League. These are generally consistent for the following season, but there's a few more places knocking about in the Champions League, for example, but we'll cover exactly what happens in a few minutes in this video. Right, the Champions League begins with the champions from the 4 lowest ranked nations entering into a preliminary round. 1 team advances, so there's a semi-final and a final, with the 3 remaining teams being transferred into the Conference League. From there, the first qualifying round is where the traditional 2-legged ties begin, and sees the champions from the next 29 nations join that one successful qualifier. The losers are transferred into either the Europa League or the Conference League, which remains the case throughout all of the qualifying rounds, and I'll cover where they end up when they get into those competitions. They sort of feed in like-for-like rounds. So if you get knocked out of the first qualifying round of the Champions League, you'll enter into a second qualifying round of one of the other competitions, and stuff like that. Basically, it sort of flows down and flows through. You'll get the hang of it once you get into the qualifying rounds if you're a smaller nation in the game. So the second qualifying round splits into a Champions path and a League path. The 15 winners from the previous round are joined by the next 4 champions, so from nations 17 to 21, or it might be 16 to 20 if we're accounting for Russia not being in Europe in the game. It's kind of a bit messy with how Russia's concerned, but basically the next 4 champions are added into the Champions path, and the League's path sees the 4 league runners-up from nations 12 to 15 entering. The third qualifying round continues this split path, with the Champions path seeing 10 winners joined by 2 champions from nations 15 and 16. And the League path sees the 2 winners from the previous round joined by the 4 runners-up from nations 7 to 11, and the third place teams from nations 5 to 6. So you can see the Champions path has champions, the League path has everyone else. So the final qualifying round in the Champions League is the playoff round, which sees the champions of nations 13 and 14 joining the remaining 6 teams in the Champions path. No extra teams join the League path at this point, and this results in 6 teams in total advancing from the qualifying rounds into the competition proper. And at that point, the competition proper begins with the 32-team group stage, with 8 groups of 4 playing a double round robin for 6 games. The 6 qualifiers are joined by the winner of the previous season's Champions League and the previous season's Europa League, so the reigning champions of those 2 competitions. And note, in-game, obviously, Manchester City won the Champions League in the previous season and are already qualified, so their extra berth wasn't needed, so the distribution of places was shifted down accordingly. So that might happen in future seasons, but we'll cover that with the new format as well. The remaining group places are filled by 4 teams from the top 4 nations, 2 teams from nations 5 and 6, and the champions of nations 7 to 11. The draw for the group stages is split into 4 pots, where pot 1 sees the defending Champions League and Europa League winners joined by the champions of the highest ranking nations, with the remaining 24 teams ranked by their club coefficient. Each group is drawn 1 team from each pot, but teams from the same nation cannot be drawn into the same group. So, after the 6 group games have been played, the top 2 teams advance to the knockout stages, with the 3rd place team from each group heading to the Europa League. For the group round of 16, group winners are seeded and face group runners-up, with a caveat that teams cannot face the other team from their group, nor a team from their own nation. Those caveats are removed once the competition enters the quarter and semi-final rounds, as it's all drawn as one, with the final being played over a single match at a neutral venue. Right, now we'll move on to the 2023-24 Europa League, which begins, confusingly, with the 3rd qualifying round. So that's basically the naming convention of where teams fall out of the Champions League matches into the Europa League as well. So this is split into a Champions Path and the Main Path. The 10 teams in the Champions Path are teams that were eliminated from the 2nd qualifying round of the Champions League, and the Main Path sees 2 losers from that same Champions League round, joined by the domestic cup winners from nations 15 and 16. As before, losers from all qualifying rounds are transferred into the Europa Conference League at various stages. The playoff round removes the distinction of the 2 paths and sees those 7 winners joined by 6 losers from the Champions League 3rd qualifying round, plus the 7 domestic cup winners from nations 7 to 14. These 10 winners head into the group stage, and they're joined by another 10 losers from the Champions League qualifying rounds, plus the reigning champions of the Europa Conference League. The final 11 teams qualifying directly into the group stage are the 6 domestic cup winners from nations 1 to 6, the 4th place team from nation 5, and the 5th place team from nations 1 to 4. Okay, unlike the Champions League, the seeding for the draw is determined completely by the club coefficients, and the draw process, however, is exactly the same. 8 groups getting a team from each of the 4 pots. Caveat that teams from the same nation cannot be drawn together. Same double round robin system for 6 games in each group follows, with the 8 group winners advancing directly into the round of 16, but the 8 runners-up are paired with the 8 third-place teams from the Champions League in an extra preliminary knockout round. Once again, teams cannot be drawn against teams from the same nation at this stage, and the winners advance to the round of 16, and the format follows the same format as the Champions League from that point. Okay, deep breath. The 2023-24 Europa Conference League is absolutely massive, and we shall cover that here before moving on to what the changes for the 24-25 season looks like in all 3 competitions. So, the first qualifying round sees 64 teams enter directly, with the 16 domestic cup winners from the bottom 16 ranked nations, 25 league runners-up from nations 30 to 55, and 21 third-place teams from nations 29 to 50. Again, caveat Russia being one of those nations that they aren't appearing in the game list of nations, so there's only 54 nations in Europe on the coefficient list. Anyway, the 31 winners head into the 2nd qualifying round Main Path and are joined by 20 domestic cup winners from nations 20 to 39, 14 runners-up from nations 16 to 29, 16 third-place teams from nations 13 to 28, 8 fourth-place teams from nations 7 to 15, and the 5th-place team of nation 6. The Champions Path sees the 16 eliminated teams from the Champions League joining the competition. So the 3rd qualifying round, Champions Path, sees those 8 winners joined by 2 other teams that were eliminated from the Champions League, and the Main Path adds an additional 9 teams to the 45 winners from the previous round. They are the 3 cup winners from nations 17 to 19, 5 third-place teams from nations 7 to 12, and the 4th-place team from nation 6. So the playoff round Champions Path sees those 5 winners joined by 5 teams eliminated from the Europa League in their Champions Path. And the Main Path has the 27 winners from the previous round joined by 5th place team from nation 5, 3 6th place teams from nations 2 to 4, and the League Cup winner from England, because England is special. The 22 winners from those playoff games enter into the group stages, alongside 10 teams eliminated from the same stage of the Europa League qualifying rounds. The group stage follows the same format as the Europa League, with clubs ranked directly by their club coefficient and placed into 4 seeded pots. Each of the 8 groups have 1 team from each pot, with teams from the same nation unable to be drawn together. Unlike the Europa League, the 8 group winners advance directly into the round of 16. Like the Europa League, they advance into the round of 16, with the runners-up facing off against the third-place teams from the Europa League in a preliminary knockout round. The format for the Conference League continues to match the Europa League through to the final as well. Okay, now we've covered all of that, and it's going to completely change for season number 2. Wonderful. If you don't want the formats to change, check out the video on how to keep the current format in your save game, which will be linked at the end of this video. It's basically a data update that keeps the same format forever and doesn't change it. But if you are playing on the vanilla version and don't have that data update included, you'll start getting emails that will make a little bit of sense and a little bit confusing from the middle of May, as you'll receive a race for coefficient email, which looks a bit like this, that tells you which 2 nations are having the best season currently in Europe, or in the 3 European competitions. That will just be a bit of an indicator of what's to come, because on or around the 15th of June 2024, you're going to receive a cluster of emails back to back to back about the new formats for the Champions League, Europa League and the Conference League, as well as a finalised look at the race for coefficient. We'll cover what that means when we get to the new Champions League format in a second. You can also view that race for the coefficient places in the same part of the game where you view the coefficient rankings and the qualification places, but you get an email about it every year anyway. Okay, the qualifying rounds for the Champions League follow a similar structure to previously, but do change sufficiently enough that we're going to go through them all again anyway, probably a little bit quicker hopefully this time. So the first qualifying round sees 30 champions from the bottom ranked nations enter, and it's worth noting that the 2-leg knockout tournament format continues for all qualifying and knockout rounds of all competitions, so we're not going to say that every time. Losing teams from this round are transferred into the Conference League, and in subsequent rounds they are transferred into the Europa League. So the 15 winners are joined by 9 champions from nations 15 to 24 in the second qualifying round Champions Path, with the 6 runners-up from nations 10 to 15 entering into the League Path. No extra team joins the Champions Path in the third qualifying round, but the League Path sees the entry of 3 runners-up from nations 7 to 19, along with the third place team from nation 6 and the fourth place team from nation 5. For the playoff round, 4 more champions enter from nations 11 to 14. They go into the Champions Path to join the previous winners, and no more teams enter the League Path, and it's the 7 winners from these games that enter into the new expanded league phase. And the league phase consists now of 36 teams, so those 7 qualifiers are joined by the reigning champions of the Champions League and the Europa League, an extra team from the 2 nations who topped the race for coefficient table that we talked about a second ago. Simply, that's just the nation coefficient from the most recent season, not a rolling 5-year average. The top 4 teams from nations 1 to 4, 3 teams from nations 5, 2 teams from nation 6, and the champions of nations 7 to 10. They all go directly into the league phase, but that league phase is not split into groups anymore, as all 36 teams are grouped together in one table. This doesn't mean that each team plays all of the others, because that would be absolute madness. Don't give you away for ideas. All teams are seeded into 4 pots of 9 based on their club coefficients. Each team then gets drawn to face 2 teams from each of the 4 pots for a total of 8 matches. So if you're in pot 1, you will face 2 other teams from pot 1 and 2 teams from 2, 3 and 4. So you get 8 games in total, basically a spread of the whole field. You get an email as well, which will show you your fixtures and which pot they come from and their ranking in Europe, basically. Teams can only face 1 other team from their nation if that nation is having 4 or more teams in the competition. Otherwise, you cannot face a team from your own nation. All 36 teams are ranked in a table, with the top 8 advancing directly to the round of 16. Teams ranked 9th to 24th head into a playoff round. And there's no teams from the league phase transferred into either the Europa League or the Conference League anymore. That's it. Your competition is over if you finish in the bottom 8. The winners advance to the round of 16 from this knockout round. So it's basically 9th to 16 faces a team, is seeded to face a team 17th to 24th. Those winners go into the round of 16 to face a team ranked 1st to 8th from the league phase, and then those seeds are removed. from the quarterfinals onwards. If we move into the Europa League next, the first qualifying round sees the 18 domestic cup winners from nations 16 to 34 enter. The winners advance, with the losing teams transferring into the Conference League. The second qualifying round sees 6 third-place teams from nations 7 to 12 and the fourth-place team from nation 6 enter. The third qualifying round sees a Champions Path created, with 12 eliminated teams transferring from the Champions League, whilst the winners from the previous round head into the non-Champions Path. They're joined by 3 eliminated teams from the Champions League non-Champions Path, plus the 3 domestic cup winners from nations 13 to 15. And then finally, the playoff round sees the 13 winners from those previous games, joined by another 6 eliminated teams from the Champions League, 5 domestic cup winners from 8 to 9, nations 8 to 9, and the 12 winners from that round advance to the 36-team league phase. They're joined by 11 eliminated teams from the Champions League from their playoff round, along with the reigning Conference League winners, the 7 domestic cup winners from nations 1 to 7, plus the 5th place teams from nations 1 to 5. The league phase format matches the Champions League with the same draw process for 8 match days, same qualification for the knockout rounds, top 8 automatically advancing to the round of 16, and no teams being transferred into the Conference League. Okay, finally, speaking of the Conference League, we're nearly there. We're not far off the end of this video now. The new format begins with the first qualifying round. That sees 11 domestic cup winners from nations 45 to 55, 21 runners-up from nations 35 to 55, and 23rd place teams from nations 30 to 50 enter. The 26 winners advance to the non-champions path of the second qualifying round and are joined by the 9 eliminated teams from the Europa League, as well as 10 cup winners from the nations 35 to 44. 17 runners-up from nations 16 to 34. I'm lost as well, don't worry. Plus 16 third-place teams from nations 13 to 29, 9 fourth-place teams from nations 7 to 15, and the 5th-place team from nation 6. A Champions Path is also added at this round, with the 14 eliminated teams from the Champions League competing. The third qualifying round, a further eliminated team from the Champions League joins those 7 winners in the Champions Path, whilst the non-Champions Path sees 44 winners from the previous round joined by 8 eliminated teams from the Europa League. And then in the playoff round, a further 6 eliminated teams from the Europa League join the Champions Path, and 7 teams join the non-Champions Path from the Europa League. The second path also sees the entry of the final 5 teams, which is the 6th place teams from nations 1 to 5, or in England's case, the League Cup winners. This sees 24 teams qualify for the league phase alongside 12 eliminated teams from the Europa League to give us a 36-team league phase. But we're not done there. It's not the same. Don't worry, the league phase is different to the Champions League and the Europa League, because why wouldn't it be? Each team only has 6 match days in the Conference League rather than 8. So the 36 teams are ranked by club coefficient once again, but seeded into 6 pots of 6, with each team facing 1 team from each pot to get your 6 games, basically. Qualification from the league phase into the knockouts is the same, though, for the other 2 competitions. And I think we've finally got through all the formats. Basically, you go through the knockouts, you get a final, you win, and you qualify for the next year. For all 3 competitions, the league phase is sorted by goal difference, goals scored, away goals, then games won, away games won, disciplinary record, and finally coefficient. So it's important also to note, because we've not mentioned them at this point, because, why would we? For Liechtenstein, it's a bit of a special case, because all of their clubs play in the Swiss League system, so they only have 1 place available for the domestic cup winner, and as such, regardless of their coefficient ranking, that qualifier can only ever enter the Conference League. Unless you're the reigning champions of the Conference League, then you enter the Europa League, and if you win that, you can enter the Champions League. That's a good challenge. We've heard that one before. So, hopefully, you've followed along and have a pretty decent idea of how European football is going to look on Football Manager 2024. Share your thoughts on the new formats. Share your European success stories. Any discussion points in the comments. If you've followed along at all with how the qualifying system works, well done. Whilst you're there, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and check out more league guides or other great content here on the channel. And I'm going to take a deep breath and see you on the next video. Thanks a lot for watching.